The wagon rolled to a halt in front of Tobias Crow's ranch, and a cloud of dust settled like a shroud. The sun was bleeding out across the horizon, painting the big, empty sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. For 3 months, Tobias had read letters from a woman named Sarah Beth Collins, a God-fearing widow from Missouri, a woman who wrote of scripture and quiet nights, a woman who promised to fill the crushing silence that had haunted his life since he'd buried his wife and infant son. He stood on his porch, hat in his hands, heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He was ready for simple. He was ready for quiet. But the woman who stepped down from that wagon was neither simple nor quiet. She wore a dress the color of fresh blood. It clung to her in a way that was anything but modest, and her hair was piled high on her head in a cascade of black curls that had no place on the frontier. Her lips were painted a wicked shade of cherry red, and her eyes were the green of a coiled snake, sharp and knowing. She moved like she owned the very ground he'd spent his life breaking his back over. Tobias felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't a mistake. This was a reckoning. The wagon driver, a scrawny old man with eyes that darted like frightened birds, scrambled down from his seat. "Mr. Crow," he rasped, the words catching in his throat. "Got your package." Package. The word felt foul in the dry evening air. The woman in red smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips that told him she'd heard that word before. It was a smile that knocked him off balance, a smile that promised trouble he wasn't ready for. "This isn't Sarah Beth Collins," Tobias said, his voice a low growl. He stepped off the porch, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a thud. "There's been a mistake. I sent for a wife, not a—" He trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the impossible creature before him. Her laugh was like whiskey over ice, smooth and sharp all at once. "No mistake, darling," she said, her voice a low purr that seemed to wrap around him. "Though I reckon the situation's a little more complicated than you were led to believe." She pulled a folded letter from a small beaded purse. Her fingers were long and delicate as she held it out to him. "Sarah Beth sent me." Tobias stared at the letter, his hand frozen at his side. The world had just tilted on its axis, and he was struggling to find his footing. He finally took the letter. The paper was crisp, the handwriting unmistakably Sarah Beth's, but the words swam before his eyes. She'd found religion, she wrote, a higher calling. She couldn't leave her missionary work. But then the letter said something else. It said he needed someone who knew the world, someone who knew its darkness, someone who could fight. Her name, the letter said, was Violet McCall. The name hit Tobias like a physical blow. He'd heard that name whispered in saloons, spoken in hushed tones by men who thought themselves tough. Violet McCall wasn't known for her faith. She was known for her beauty, her skill at the card table, and the trail of broken, dangerous men she left in her wake. But there was more in the letter, a warning, written in a frantic, hurried script. It spoke of men who were hunting Violet, men who didn't follow the law because they were the law. It spoke of debts that could only be paid in blood. "What kind of trouble are you in?" Tobias asked, his voice barely a whisper. For the first time, Violet's smile faltered. He saw a flicker of something raw and hunted in her green eyes. "The kind that gets people killed," she said, her voice dropping so low he had to lean in to hear it. "But don't you worry, cowboy. I don't plan on staying long enough for it to catch up." The wagon driver was already scrambling back onto his seat, snapping the reins with a frantic energy. He didn't even wait for payment. He just wanted to be gone. He whipped the horses into a gallop, leaving Violet's single trunk abandoned in a cloud of dust. Tobias swallowed hard, the dry grit coating his tongue. This was no accident. Someone had sent this woman to his doorstep for a reason. They'd sent her to the most isolated ranch in the territory, a place where a person could disappear. And whoever wanted her hidden must have known exactly what kind of hell would follow her. "You can't stay here," he said, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. They were a lie, and they both knew it. "This is a respectable place," he tried again, a desperate plea. "I have a reputation." Violet almost laughed. "Respectable," she repeated, the word tasting like poison. That's a luxury for people who've never had to choose between their reputation and their life. She walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate, a predator closing in. Her gaze was so intense it felt like a brand on his skin. "A woman like me," she murmured, "could ruin a man like you just by breathing the same air." He clenched his jaw. He thought of the last 3 years. 3 years since he'd buried Martha and their boy. 3 years of gut-wrenching silence, of a loneliness so profound it felt like a sickness of the soul. He had hollowed himself out, leaving nothing but dust and grief inside. And this woman, this breathtaking, dangerous woman, stood before him and saw it all. She saw the empty spaces inside him and wasn't afraid. "It's not just about reputation," he said, his voice tight. "You said it yourself. There are dangerous men looking for you. I won't have that trouble here." She stopped just inches from him, so close he could smell her perfume. It was a rich, exotic scent, like night-blooming flowers and smoke. It was the smell of a world he knew nothing about. "Tell me, cowboy," she whispered, her voice like silk. "Are you afraid of the danger, or are you afraid of me?" Before he could answer, she reached out and her fingers brushed his as she gently touched the letter he was still clutching. "Sarah Beth told me about your wife," she said, her tone shifting, becoming soft, almost tender. "She told me about the baby." The words were a knife in his gut. How? He had never written about Martha. He had never shared the depth of that wound with anyone. Violet's smile was sad now, tinged with a shared pain he didn't understand. "Sarah Beth and we go way back. We both made the mistake of trusting the wrong man, and we both have the scars to prove it." She tilted her head, and in the fading light he saw it, a thin, silvery line along her jaw, almost invisible. A scar. Her eyes darkened with a terrifying memory. "The men looking for me? They aren't just hired guns. They own judges. They own sheriffs. They make people vanish into thin air." A cold dread snaked its way down Tobias's spine. The wind picked up, howling through the eaves of the porch. But beneath it, there was a new silence. A heavy, watchful silence. Even the horses in the corral were restless, their whinnies sharp with fear. "They don't know about this place," Violet said, her voice trembling slightly. Then she added two words that sealed his fate. "Not yet." And in that instant, Tobias Crow knew his quiet life was over. It had been a ghost of a life anyway. Whatever storm Violet McCall had brought to his ranch, it was bigger than her past, bigger than his loneliness, bigger than the grief that had defined him for so long. It was a storm of blood and secrets, and it had just made landfall on his porch. The night clamped down on the small ranch house, thick and suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, sounded like a threat. Tobias stood by the window in the main room, his hand resting on the cool steel of the rifle, leaning against the wall. The rifle felt heavier tonight. In the spare room, Violet sat on the edge of the cot. The lantern cast flickering shadows across her face, making her look younger, more vulnerable. The crimson dress was gone, replaced by a simple borrowed shirt of his that was far too big for her. She looked less like a force of nature now, and more like someone holding themselves together with nothing but sheer, stubborn will. "You should get some rest," Tobias said, his voice rougher than he intended. She offered a faint smile that didn't come close to reaching her haunted green eyes. "Rest is a luxury I gave up a long time ago, not with men like Judge Morrison's hounds on my trail." The name hung in the air between them, cold and sharp. Judge Morrison. Tobias knew the name. Everyone did. It was printed in the newspapers, always connected to railroad deals and land grabs. A man of immense power, a man who moved mountains and crushed anyone who stood in his way, a man who was utterly untouchable. Violet's voice dropped, each word landing like a stone in the heavy silence. Sarah Beth. She was his wife. Tobias felt a jolt, as if the floor had dropped out from under him. The pieces started to click into place, sharp and jagged. "That's how she knew about you," Violet continued, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside the window. "She knew about your lawsuit against the railroad. Morrison was trying to steal your land, just like he's stolen from hundreds of others. When she found out too much, when she found proof, he tried to have her committed. locked away where no one would ever listen to her again. Violet's hands clenched into fists in her lap. I'm the one who got her out. His land. The lawsuit he'd been fighting for years. Sarah Beth's sudden, strange letters about missionary work. It wasn't a series of unfortunate events. It was a web. And he was caught in the center of it, and he hadn't even known. Violet McCall hadn't just appeared in his life by chance. She was a soldier delivered to the front line of a war he never realized he was fighting. A sharp crack echoed from outside. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a dry twig snapping under a heavy boot. Tobias's body went rigid, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. He motioned for Violet to stay quiet, his eyes scanning the blackness beyond the porch. Violet was already moving, silent as a cat. She crept to the window beside him, peering through a crack in the curtains. Her breath was warm against his arm. That's not your imagination, cowboy, she whispered, her voice tight with adrenaline. They found us. The words were barely out of her mouth when the night exploded. Glass shattered in the kitchen window, followed by the splintering crash of the back door being kicked in. Heavy boots thudded on his wooden floors, the sound of men spreading through his home like a plague. A voice, cold and authoritative, cut through the chaos. Federal Marshal, we have a warrant for the arrest of Violet McCall and for any man found harboring her. Come out with your hands in the air, Crow. Violet's fingers dug into his arm, her nails sharp. That's Crawford, she hissed, a venomous fury in her tone. He's Morrison's top man. He's no more a marshal than I am a saint. He's a butcher with a bought and paid for badge. Tobias's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, but his mind went cold and clear. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. He looked at the terror in Violet's eyes, and something inside him, something long dead, roared back to life. He wouldn't let them take her. He spun around, grabbing the edge of the thick bearskin rug by the hearth. With a heave, he threw it back, revealing the dark, square outline of a trap door. Root cellar, he whispered, his voice urgent, as he pried the door open with the barrel of his rifle. It connects to an old mining tunnel. Comes out by the barn. Violet didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. As the first lantern flare appeared in the hallway, she was already slipping down into the musty darkness. Tobias followed, pulling the heavy wooden door shut just as the shadow of a man holding a rifle fell across the parlor floor. The darkness was absolute. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and old secrets. Tobias led the way, his calloused hand trailing along the rough-hewn dirt wall to guide him. His rifle was held tight in his other hand. Behind him he heard Violet stumble, and her hand shot out, grabbing his shoulder to steady herself. The touch sent a strange current through him. It was a silent acknowledgement. They were in this together now. Their fates were intertwined. As they shuffled through the narrow passage, her voice came out of the blackness, a low, urgent whisper. Sarah Beth told me something else. Something about your wife, Martha. Tobias stopped dead. The mention of his late wife's name in this dark, desperate place felt like a sacrilege. She said Martha's father was a government surveyor. Violet pressed on, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. She said he left you an old iron safe, and inside that safe are documents, his personal survey maps, deeds, mineral surveys for the whole territory. A memory, dusty and long forgotten, surfaced in Tobias's mind. An old, heavy safe tucked away in the barn loft, under a pile of old blankets. It had been Martha's dowry, and he hadn't touched it since her funeral. He'd never even thought to open it. Morrison isn't just after me, Violet's voice was grim. He's been hunting for those maps for years. Martha's father knew where the gold was. He knew where the rivers ran deep enough for a railroad. With those maps, Morrison wouldn't just own your land, he'd own everything. The weight of it settled on him. This wasn't just about a woman on the run. It was about the fate of the entire territory. And the only thing standing in Morrison's way was a dusty old safe in his barn. The tunnel began to slope upward. The scent of hay and horses replaced the smell of damp earth. He could hear them now, directly above. The slow, deliberate creak of floorboards. Someone was in the barn. Waiting. Violet's hand found his in the dark. She pressed something small, cold and heavy into his palm. A Derringer pistol. 2 shots, she whispered, her voice a ghost in the dark. Make them count. He wanted to argue, to tell her to stay back, but there was no time. He found the edge of the tunnel door, a small wooden panel hidden behind a loose stack of hay bales. With a deep breath, he pushed it open and rolled out, his rifle already coming up to his shoulder. A man stood in the center of the barn, his back to them, his own rifle held at the ready. He turned at the sound, his eyes widening in surprise. But before Tobias could even take aim, a shadow moved past him. Violet. She was a blur of motion, grabbing a pitchfork from the wall and lunging forward. She moved with a speed and ferocity that stunned him. In a heartbeat, she had the sharp tines of the pitchfork pressed against the man's throat. Deputy Crawford, I presume, she said, her voice dripping with sweet poison. The man Crawford sneered, but Tobias could see the sweat beating on his temple. The fear in his eyes was real. Morrison will be very pleased to have you back, Violet. Funny, she replied, her voice dangerously soft as she pushed the pitchfork just a little harder, drawing a thin line of blood. Because I have a feeling he's a whole lot more worried about what's in that safe upstairs than he is about me. Crawford's face went white. He hadn't known. Morrison hadn't trusted his own man with the full story. For a split second, a sliver of hope cut through Tobias. Maybe they had a chance. Maybe they had some leverage. But that hope was extinguished in an instant by a sound from outside. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, thundering toward the ranch, getting closer with every second. And with them, the flickering, hellish glow of torches. Tobias looked from Crawford to the barn door, his mind racing. Back up? Crawford's sneer returned, colder and more confident this time. Not back up, Crow. Insurance. He let out a short, cruel laugh. Judge Morrison doesn't like loose ends. Tobias and Violet locked eyes over Crawford's shoulder. The terrible truth crashed down on them, heavy and cold as a tombstone. Those riders weren't here to make an arrest. They were a cleanup crew, sent to burn the ranch to the ground, to destroy the maps, and to make sure no one, not Tobias, not Violet, and not even their own man, Crawford, was left alive to tell the tale. The first torch arched through the night sky, landing on the dry roof of the house with a whoosh of exploding flame. The home Tobias had built with his own two hands was turning into a funeral pyre. Violet's grip on the pitchfork tightened, her knuckles white. Her eyes, reflecting the growing fire, burned with a furious, desperate light. Then we ride, she said, her voice a low, determined growl. And as the flames roared, Tobias knew he wasn't just running for his life anymore. He was running for hers, and in that moment, that felt like the only thing in the world that mattered. The bay horse screamed, its eyes wide with terror as the flames licked at the sky. Tobias threw the saddle on its back, his movements frantic and clumsy. His heart was a wild thing in his chest, hammering against his ribs. He could feel the heat of the fire on his face, hear the roar as his life's work turned to ash and smoke. Get on! Violet yelled at Crawford, shoving him toward her own horse. He scrambled into the saddle, a prisoner now, his face pale in the firelight. Violet swung up behind him in a single fluid motion, her borrowed shirt billowing around her. She held the small derringer pressed firmly against his spine. Tobias mounted his gelding, the leather creaking under his weight. He took one last look at his burning home, the porch where he'd waited for a wife, the window where he'd stood watch over an empty life. All of it was gone. He wrenched the reins, turning the horse's head toward the dark maw of the canyon trail, and kicked its flanks hard. They rode like the devil himself was on their heels. The narrow path was treacherous, a twisting ribbon of rock and shadow. Behind them, the torches of Morrison's men bobbed in the darkness, a pack of hungry wolves closing in. The crack of rifle fire echoed off the canyon walls, bullets whining past their heads, chipping sparks from the rocks around them. They didn't stop. They didn't dare. They pushed the horses until their sides were heaving and lathered with sweat. They rode through the night, fueled by nothing but fear and the desperate primal need to survive. By the time the sun finally clawed its way over the eastern mountains, they were miles away, hidden deep in the Badlands. The horses were spent, their clothes were torn and caked with dust, but they were alive. Tobias risked a glance at Violet. The crimson dress was a distant memory. Her black hair had come loose, whipping around her face in the wind. There were scratches on her cheeks and a wild, feverish look in her eyes. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a warrior. She looked like a survivor. She met his gaze, and for a moment, the world fell away. There was no fire, no chase, no Judge Morrison. There was only the silent understanding that passed between two people who had just been through hell together. They had saved each other. 3 days later, they walked into the federal marshal's office in the territorial capital. They were a sorry sight, covered in grime and smelling of smoke and horses. But in Tobias's saddlebags, wrapped in oilcloth, was the key to everything. Marshal Hayes was a bulldog of a man, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. He carefully unwrapped the contents of the safe and spread the yellowed maps and documents across his desk. The papers felt sacred, like relics from a forgotten world. Hayes leaned forward, his finger tracing the lines drawn by Martha's father so many years ago. A low whistle escaped his lips. "My God," he breathed, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and fury. "These maps, they prove everything. The illegal land grabs, the bribes, the false mineral claims. It's all here." He looked up, his eyes blazing. "With these and Crawford's testimony, we can bring Morrison's entire empire crashing down around his ears." Crawford, who had been slumped in a chair in the corner, looking pale and defeated, gave a stiff, reluctant nod. He had chosen survival over loyalty, trading his testimony for immunity from prosecution. Violet watched him like a hawk, her gaze a silent promise of what would happen if he even thought about backing out. But Tobias wasn't looking at the maps. He wasn't looking at Crawford. His eyes were on Violet. She stood by the large window looking out at the bustling city below. The morning sun streamed in, catching the dust motes dancing in the air and illuminating her profile. For the first time since she had arrived at his ranch in that blood-red dress, she looked peaceful. The hunted look was gone from her eyes. The tension had left her shoulders. It was as if a great weight had finally been lifted. When the meeting was over, they stepped out into the bright, noisy street. The city was a cacophony of sounds and smells, a world away from the quiet solitude of his ranch. "What happens now?" Tobias asked, his voice feeling lost in the din. She turned to face him, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time. It transformed her face, softening the hard edges and revealing a beauty that had nothing to do with painted lips or fancy dresses. "Now," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I testify. I watch them put Morrison in a cage for the rest of his life. I make sure he can never hurt anyone, ever again." She paused, her green eyes searching his. "And after that, if you'll have me, Tobias, I'd like to help you rebuild." He stared at her, stunned. "Rebuild? Violet, the ranch is gone. It's nothing but ash." Her smile widened. "The land is still yours. The government will have to pay you damages for what Morrison's men did. And I've saved some money over the years." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Enough for lumber. Enough for cattle. Enough to start over." She took a hesitant step closer. "You don't have to do it alone this time." 6 months passed. Tobias stood on the porch of a new house, built on the bones of the old one. The air smelled of fresh-cut pine and hope. The silence was different now. It wasn't an empty, aching void. It was a peaceful quiet, filled with the promise of a future. In the small vegetable garden she had insisted on planting, Violet knelt in the rich, dark earth. Her dress was simple calico, her hands were smudged with dirt, and her face was tilted up to the warm afternoon sun. She had traded her secrets for seeds, her perfume for the scent of soil. She had kept her word. They had rebuilt, not just the fences and the barn, but something inside him that he thought had been burned away forever. Judge Morrison had died in a federal prison, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered across the territory. Crawford, true to his word, had testified and then vanished, seeking a new life out west. And the maps, the legacy of a good man, had become the foundation for new laws, protecting settlers from the greed of powerful men. But all of that felt distant, like a story that had happened to someone else. The only thing that felt real was the sight of Violet looking up from her garden, her face breaking into a radiant smile when she saw him watching. He had sent for a simple, quiet wife to fill the emptiness of his home. Instead, he got a storm, a beautiful, dangerous whirlwind of a woman who tore his life down to the foundations. And then, with her own two hands, helped him build it back, stronger than before. Standing there on his new porch, with Violet in his garden and a future stretching out before them, Tobias Crow finally understood. Sometimes the person you think is the biggest mistake of your life is actually the one who was sent to save you from it. But the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The peace they had built was a fragile thing, a glass house on a fault line, because they had taken down a king, but they hadn't wiped out his court. Morrison had allies, men who had gotten rich off his schemes, men who were just as ruthless, just as greedy. And those men were not the forgiving type. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A brand on a calf that wasn't his. Fences cut in the dead of night. Small things. Annoyances meant to unnerve him, to remind him that he wasn't safe. Tobias reinforced his fences and started carrying his rifle with him everywhere he went, the way he had in the early days. The peace was already starting to fray at the edges. Violet saw it too. He would catch her staring at the horizon, her eyes narrowed, that old hunted look creeping back in. She started cleaning her derringer again every night, the quiet clicks of the mechanism a grim counterpoint to the crickets outside. "It's not over, is it?" he said to her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the long road that led to their ranch. "When you cut the head off a snake, the body still thrashes for a while." Her words were prophetic. A week later, a man rode up to the ranch. He wasn't a thug or a hired gun. He was dressed in a fine suit, his face clean-shaven, his hands soft. He introduced himself as Mr. Sterling, a lawyer representing the railroad. He wasn't there to threaten. He was there to bargain. He offered Tobias a staggering amount of money for his land, 10 times what it was worth. "Judge Morrison's associates wish to put the past behind them," Sterling said, his voice smooth as oil. "They see this as a gesture of goodwill, a way to make amends. It was a bribe, plain and simple. Blood money. Take it and walk away. Forget everything that happened." "My land's not for sale," Tobias said, his voice hard as iron. Sterling's polite smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "That's a pity, Mr. Crow, a real pity. My clients are men who are accustomed to getting what they want." He tipped his hat. "Think about it. The offer won't stand forever." Iowani. As Sterling rode away, Violet stepped out onto the porch, a shotgun held loosely in her hands. "That wasn't an offer," she said, her voice grim. "That was a final warning." The very next day, Marshal Hayes rode out from the Capitol. His face was etched with worry. "There's been a complication, Tobias," he said, dismounting. "The ledger, the one from the safe with all the names and payments." "What about it?" Tobias asked, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "It's vanished," Hayes said, his voice low. "Stolen right out of the evidence locker in my office. My deputy was found dead at his desk this morning. The place was ransacked. Whoever did this was a professional." Tobias and Violet exchanged a dark look. The one piece of evidence that tied all of Morrison's cronies together was gone. The maps proved Morrison's crimes, but the ledger proved theirs. Without it, men like Sterling were untouchable. "There's more," Hayes said, his face grim. "They're trying to get Crawford's testimony thrown out, claiming he was coerced. Morrison's old lawyer is pulling every string he can. They're trying to rewrite history, Tobias. They're trying to paint Morrison as a victim and Violet as a liar and a murderer." The world suddenly felt very small and very dangerous again. They hadn't just made enemies. They had inherited a war. "What do we do?" Tobias asked, looking at Violet. Her jaw was set, her eyes burning with a cold fire he hadn't seen since the night the ranch burned. "We don't wait for them to come for us," she said, her voice quiet but deadly serious. "We go after them. We lost the ledger, so we'll just have to become the ledger." That night a strange rider appeared at their gate. He was an old man, weathered and wiry, and he led a pack mule carrying a heavy load. He said he was sent by Sarah Beth. He didn't bring a message. He brought a crate. Inside, nestled in straw, were rifles of a make Tobias had never seen before, repeating rifles that could fire 15 shots without reloading. There were also boxes of ammunition and several sticks of dynamite. At the very bottom of the crate was a small, sealed envelope addressed to Violet. She opened it, her hands trembling slightly. She read the letter, her expression unreadable. When she was done, she looked up at Tobias and her eyes were filled with a terrible resolve. "Sarah Beth has been busy," she said, a grim smile touching her lips. "She didn't just find religion, she found Morrison's other victims. She's been organizing them. Farmers, ranchers, miners, everyone he ever ruined. They've been waiting for a sign." She held up the letter. "This is it. They're ready to fight." A new terrifying thought dawned on Tobias. This was bigger than his ranch now. It was bigger than just him and Violet. It was a revolution, and they were standing at the heart of it. But there was another twist, another secret buried in the letter. Violet's face went pale as she read the last few lines. She looked up at Tobias, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "It wasn't just the ledger they stole from the marshal's office," she whispered, her voice shaking. "There was something else in there. Something they were really after." She took a shaky breath. "Sarah Beth says there was a second set of documents with the ledger. Personal letters. Letters between Morrison and a U.S. senator, proving the corruption goes all the way to Washington." Tobias felt the ground shift beneath him again. This wasn't just a territorial dispute anymore. This was treason. "And the man who has those letters now," Violet said, her voice barely audible, "the man leading all of Morrison's old partners is the senator's own brother. His name was Alistair Finch, and unlike Morrison, he didn't hide in the shadows. He was the charismatic, powerful owner of the rival railroad, a man seen by the public as a hero, a man who had pretended to be their ally. He had played them all, and now he had the one thing that could burn them all to the ground. He held the power to not only clear Morrison's name, but to brand Tobias and Violet as criminals and anarchists. He had them in a vice. "He wants to meet," Violet said, reading from the letter. "He sent a message through Sarah Beth's network. He's willing to trade." "Trade what?" Tobias asked, though he already knew the answer. "The letters for the maps," she said. "He gives us the proof to keep ourselves out of prison, and we give him the key to owning the entire territory, legally and completely." It was a devil's bargain. Save themselves or save the future of every honest settler in the territory. "It's a trap," Tobias said immediately. "He'll take the maps and kill us anyway." "I know," Violet said, her eyes meeting his. "But we don't have a choice. We have to go, because Sarah Beth included one more detail." She paused, the weight of the next words heavy in the air. "The meeting place is Blackwood Gorge, at the old trestle bridge." Tobias felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the night air. Blackwood Gorge. The place was cursed. A narrow, treacherous canyon where a railroad crew had died years ago. A place of ghosts and bad memories. It was also the place where Martha's father, the surveyor who had drawn the maps, had fallen to his death. The death that had always been ruled an accident. It was no accident. Finch was sending them a message. He was telling them he knew everything. He was telling them he was going to finish what he and Morrison had started years ago. He wasn't just planning to kill them. He was planning to bury them with their secrets in the exact same spot where the whole bloody story began. The ride to Blackwood Gorge was silent and tense. They rode with 3 other ranchers, allies Sarah Beth had sent, their faces grim and set. The new rifles felt heavy and purposeful in their saddle scabbards. The dynamite was wrapped carefully in oilcloth, a heavy, ominous weight. The gorge was a jagged scar in the earth, a place the sun rarely touched. The old trestle bridge spanned the chasm, its timbers skeletal and rotting against the sky. It was a place of death. Finch was waiting for them on the other side, just as he said he would be. He wasn't alone. He had a dozen men with him, all heavily armed, their rifles glinting in the gloom. Alistair Finch was the opposite of Morrison. He was handsome, charming, dressed in the finest tailored clothes. He looked more like a politician than a crime lord. His smile was wide and friendly, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were cold, dead things. "Mr. Crow, Miss McCall, so glad you could make it," he called out, his voice echoing in the gorge. "I trust you brought what I came for." Tobias held up the leather satchel containing the maps. And I trust you brought the letters. Finch laughed, a booming, confident sound. He held up a matching satchel. Of course, a deal is a deal. He gestured to the bridge. Let's make the exchange in the middle. Just the two of us, Crow. No need for any unpleasantness. It was the most obvious trap Tobias had ever seen. He looked at Violet. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The plan was set. Tobias dismounted, taking the satchel with the maps. He started walking onto the bridge, his boots thudding on the rotting wood. The chasm below was a dizzying drop to the jagged rocks and rushing water. Finch started walking from the other side, a mirror image. They met in the middle. The bridge groaned under their combined weight. The maps, Crow, Finch said, his smile tightening. The letters, Finch, Tobias countered. Finch held out his satchel. Tobias reached for it, and as their hands were about to touch, Finch's smile vanished. You know, Finch said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, your father-in-law was a stubborn man too, stood right here on this very spot. He wouldn't sell his maps either. A man has to protect his investments. It was the confession, the final piece. So you killed him, Tobias said, his voice flat. Finch shrugged. Business is business. That was the signal. From the rocks above the gorge, Violet gave the command. Now! One of the ranchers with them lit the fuse on the first stick of dynamite and hurled it. It wasn't aimed at Finch's men. It was aimed at the far side of the trestle bridge. The explosion was deafening. Wood and rock blasted into the air. The far end of the bridge, Finch's only escape route, splintered and collapsed into the chasm. He was trapped. His men opened fire, and the gorge erupted into a war zone. Bullets tore through the air, splintering the rocks where Violet and the others were taking cover. On the bridge, Finch's face was a mask of fury. He dropped the satchel of letters and drew a pistol. You foolish farmer, he screamed. You've just signed your own death warrant. But Tobias was ready. He dove to the side as Finch fired, the bullet whizzing past his head. He dropped the satchel of maps and drew his own revolver. He wasn't a farmer anymore. He was a man defending his home, his life, his future. He fired back. His shot went wide. Finch's shot tore a splinter from the planking next to his hand. Below them, the river raged. Above, the battle raged. And on the bridge, two men were locked in a fight to the death. But Violet had another surprise. From her position, she could see something Tobias and Finch couldn't. Another group of riders appearing on the ridgeline. It wasn't more of Finch's men. It was Marshal Hayes, and he had a posse of 24 deputies with him. Sarah Beth's message hadn't just gone to the ranchers. It had gone to the law, too. Finch! Hayes's voice boomed through a bullhorn. Alistair Finch, you are surrounded. You are under arrest for the murder of Marshal John Stapleton and for conspiracy against the United States government. Checkmate. Finch looked from Tobias to the army of lawmen, his face contorting in a snarl of pure hatred. He was cornered, beaten, but he wasn't going to be taken alive. With a wild scream of rage, he lunged at Tobias. He wasn't trying to shoot him. He was trying to tackle him, to send them both plunging into the abyss. They went down in a tangle of limbs, wrestling on the narrow, swaying bridge. Finch was strong, fueled by desperation. His fingers clawed at Tobias's face, his pistol forgotten. The bridge groaned, the old timbers screaming in protest. A support beam snapped with a crack like a rifle shot. The section of the bridge they were on tilted violently. Tobias lost his grip. Finch grinned, a terrifying, triumphant look in his eyes. But as the bridge gave way, Tobias did the last thing Finch expected. He kicked off the collapsing edge, pushing himself away from Finch and back toward the solid part of the bridge. Finch, however, was not so lucky. He was thrown off balance, his scream echoing through the gorge as he, the satchel of letters, and the crumbling remains of the bridge plunged into the river below. There was a great splash, and then silence. The battle was over. Finch's men threw down their weapons and surrendered. Tobias lay on the edge of the broken bridge, his chest heaving, his hands raw. He looked down into the churning water, but there was no sign of Alistair Finch. He was gone. The letters, the proof, were gone with him. But it didn't matter. They had a dozen witnesses. They had Finch's own men who would surely testify to save their own necks. They had won. Violet was the first one to reach him. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands checking him for injuries. Her face was smudged with gunpowder. Her hair was a mess, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You're a fool, Tobias Crow," she said, her voice choked with relief. "I know," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. She leaned down and kissed him, right there on the edge of the broken bridge, with the lawmen and the ranchers and the whole world watching. And in that moment, Tobias knew he was finally, truly home. The aftermath was swift. Finch's empire crumbled overnight. The senator in Washington resigned in disgrace. The story of the farmer and the saloon girl who took down a corrupt dynasty became a legend, a story told around campfires all across the territory. Tobias and Violet went back to the ranch. They rebuilt the fences. They planted their crops. They bought more cattle. Life returned to a quiet rhythm, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a quiet born of peace, not of loneliness. One evening, months later, a wagon rolled up to their gate. A lone woman sat on the driver's seat. She was dressed in a simple, modest dress, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. It was Sarah Beth. She looked older, her face lined with the things she had seen, but her eyes were clear and strong. She had come to say thank you and to say goodbye. She was heading west to California to help start a new mission, a home for women who were running from men like her husband. The three of them sat on the porch that night, three survivors of a war no one else would ever truly understand. They didn't talk much about the past. They talked about the future, about building things instead of tearing them down. As Sarah Beth's wagon disappeared down the long road the next morning, Violet slipped her hand into Tobias's. "It's really over," she said softly. "It's just beginning," he replied, pulling her close. He had written a letter, hoping for a simple wife to share a simple life. He'd been sent a warrior, a spy, a hero. He'd been sent into a storm of fire and blood and conspiracy. He had lost everything he had, and in the end, he had gained more than he had ever dared to dream of. He had found a love that was forged in chaos and tempered by fire, a love that was stronger than any fence, more valuable than any map, a love that had, quite literally, saved his life. He looked out over his land, his home, with his wife by his side, and he knew, deep in his bones, that the greatest adventures often begin with what looks like a terrible mistake. If you enjoyed this wild ride, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what kind of trouble we'll get into next.